I'm going to share my screen with you guys. When you go into your materials, I just made visible the soldered ring project. In here, that's not what I wanted. In here is the presentation that I'm going to go over right now. This is where your sketches are due. Your sketches are going to be due tomorrow at the end of the day. So 5 sketches are going to go here. And then here's a checklist that we'll get to later when it comes to what you need to do before it's time to solder. So a soldered ring. This is an easy seam soldering project. So we first learn how to solder a seam. Then your next project will be learning how to solder something on top of something else. So you guys are going to create a metal ring held together with solder. Those of you that are fully virtual, you are not required to solder. If you choose to come in at 1:30 to solder or on a Friday, because that's new, you can. If you don't want to solder and you don't want to come in, then you're going to make a ring that is adjustable, so you don't have to solder it. Vocabulary. A lot of these words aren't going to make sense, and when I go over soldering, then hopefully they'll make sense, but you're going to use a flux, and this is something that you put on metal to keep it clean. Pickle is everybody's favorite. It's when you make pickles, you put pickles in a vinegar, and it's the same idea. It's an acid that you put your project in that cleans it up. Soldering is the process which in 2 or more items are joined together by melting or putting a solder into the joint. The filler metal has a lower melting point, so the idea is that when you heat up your metal, when metal heats up, the molecules pull apart slightly, and then the solder has a lower melting point than your project. So if your solder melts at 1400 degrees and your ring melts at 1800 degrees, you want the solder to melt, not your ring. So a lot of people try and solder jewelry that they already own or that they already have. If you have a piece that you know wasn't made out of precious metal, like you made it like cutting and everything, a lot of times a lot of jewelry is made by pouring it into a mold, like most belt buckles, and that metal has a very low melting point. So if you heat something up that's got a low melting point, it melts when it reaches that melting point. So it's like butter. Butter has a very low melting point. You can melt it very easily. Some metals melt easier than others. The metals that we have, they don't have a melting point till about 1900 to 2000 degrees. So your project should not melt unless you're purposefully trying to like burn a hole through it or melt a hole through it. So unlike welding, soldering does not involve melting your work into pieces. A seam solder is what we're doing. We're going to solder along one seam. So when you make your ring, you're going to make it long and flat like a rectangle. Then you bend it so the ends meet, and that's what we solder together. Sweat soldering is when you melt solder onto something else. And then a torch is your portable apparatus that produces a very hot flame by the combustion of gases. The torches that we use are designed for metalworking. You want to kind of stay away from soldering irons that you would use for electronics because they tend to make a big blob of metal, of solder. Whereas when we are soldering, you can actually, you can really control where the solder goes and how hot everything gets. So these are some examples, and really rough examples of rings. But you have 2 basic requirements for the ring. So I want to see at least 5 different sketches from you. Your 2 requirements are this. You have to have at least 3 piercings from inside your ring. So at least 3 areas in the ring have to be cut out. Think small piercings. You don't need huge ones. And at least one of your edges must be altered. So one edge can be straight. So you have 2 edges to a ring. You've got the top edge and the bottom edge that sit around your finger. One of them can be straight. One of them has to be altered in some way. So you either cut a notch out of it, you change the shape. But you have to have 3 piercings inside your ring and 1 altered edge. You also have to pass the soldering test with 100% in order to be able to solder. So I have a checklist on there that's already there. I'm going to make videos, and I'm going to go over it live. So there are many resources for you to look into when you're trying to complete your test. Again, if you're fully virtual, you can arrange a time to come in to solder if you want, or you're just going to make an adjustable ring that's not sealed shut. So procedure, you guys are going to cut a strip of that paper that I gave you, like the computer paper. It's is really, really high tech. You're going to cut a strip of paper and you're going to wrap it around whatever finger you want to make a ring with. Where the paper meets up is how big your ring needs to be. You're going to then trace that rectangle 5 times on your sketch paper. So you have 5 sketches that are all the same size, all of which would fit. Choose the one you like the best. You're going to cut it out and glue it down just like the last project. If you have one of the straight edges, line it up with the straight edge of your metal. That's one less side you have to cut. You're going to drill your holes, cut, file, and sand, and then you solder. Well, then you take the soldering test. You pass it. Then you solder, and then you polish. Polishing is the last thing that you're going to do. Because once you polish the metal, the solder is not going to work. It's not going to melt into the structure of your metal ring. So polish is last. Do everything else. Then when you would have been ready to polish, stop, do the soldering, then we polish. So here's my sketches and what I mean with an altered edge. So the altered edge, you can see, these are examples of altered edges. They're not, they're not the best drawn out and well measured. In fact, everything I do seems to be on a slant. But at least one of your edges has to be altered. So anything that alters at least one of the long edges. Also, think about how your seam is going to meet. So if you have 2 edges and they, when you put them together, make sure the tops line up with that as well. And then piercings, you have to have at least 3 piercings. So I did many piercings in mine in some examples. So at least 3 piercings on the inside. This is what your sketches are going to end up looking like. They'll be flat. You're thinking about your ring as a flat ring. Then, like here, like I said, make sure edges meet up. So make sure like the length of the sides is the same so that when we bend this and they touch, that they meet up perfectly. So here's an example. These do not meet all the requirements. This one does not have an altered edge, but you can see the little tiny, like the footprints all around the ring. This one has an altered edge, but it's only got 1 piercing in the middle. So they could put a circle on either side and that would count. Here's some more ideas. You can think of like the animal faces, but try to make it a little thicker if you're going to do something similar because it is hard to cut out, perfectly those little tiny lines. You guys know that. Here's a student example. So a couple notches cut into it and then the initials and 2 hearts. These are old examples too. That's why they're not all polished and cleaned up. This one has the altered edge, but it's only got 3 little holes drilled in that. And see what I mean by the back of this, how it does not meet up? You want that to meet up. You don't want one end to be higher than the other. And drilling circles without cutting does not count as a piercing. So those of you that are fully virtual, you're going to make a ring, but you're going to incorporate the seam into your design. So you will not solder this together. It will be adjustable. However, I want that line incorporated into what you're cutting out. So trees obviously are easier because, you've got the center line that goes up and you can have branches coming off either side. You can also make an animal, so you can get creative with how you incorporate this seam in there. So this is a cat's face. They cut lines with the saw on either side to make it look like whiskers. Here's one with no drilled holes and no piercings, and it isn't soldered, so you could use a saw to make something like this. That's why I said trees really work. Here's a student example. So a flower was the seam. And here's one I really like. So this is like, a bass clef is the seam here. So your seam has to be incorporated into your design in some way. Rubric, it's worth 50 points. So your idea, the craftsmanship, requirements, effort, and completion. Bless you.